So New Sun, as most people know by now, is Gambit's god form, right? It's Gambit in his most powerful form. But here's the kicker about the new Sun Saga. It takes place in Gambit Volume 3 from Fabian to Caesar. The biggest issue with this is it's one of these stories where New Sun just kind of bobs and weaves throughout the storyline. He never really shows up all that often. Most everything else revolves around Gambit. There's a million plot threads, and they all come together at the end of the story. So if what we're really looking to do is establish the meat and potatoes of what's going on with regards to New Sun and how he ties into Gambit, that comes in a couple different places. The first one is it's Gambit issue number 1/2. I know it sounds weird. The idea behind that issue was that Gambit was basically abandoned in Antarctica by the X-Men. Why? Because that was at the time that the X-Men had discovered he was a part of the mutant massacre. Most all of you guys have heard of that, right? The storyline where Sinister sent his marauders into the sewers of New York to basically massacre the Morlocks. Gambit had led them there, but he didn't know the marauders were going to massacre the Morlocks. The X-Men didn't know that, and they believed that he had willingly led them there as just part of some of the shady things he'd done in the past. And so where they abandoned him in Antarctica, they went back pretty quickly to try to find him. But that's when New Sun discovered Gambit. And the idea was that New Sun would offer Gambit a way to return back, right, to the United States or return back to the world as long as Gambit would help him. And so there were a few different instances where Gambit would carry out things directly for New Sun, but more often than not, it was New Sun manipulating things behind the scenes. So a really good example of this is the story that takes place in issue number 12. Technically it's 12 and 14, but it feeds into a story called The Sunset Dawn. The idea behind this is that in Marvel Comics, a lot of you guys have probably heard of a character called the Witness. The Witness is a version of Gambit from the far-flung future, which is basically the era that Bishop comes from. If you guys ever saw the episode of X-Men the Animated Series where Bishop comes back in time and he was like, someone betrayed the X-Men, and then like he points his gun as Gambit and he's like, you're the traitor, that kind of thing. That's borrowed from Marvel Comics. And the idea behind it was that supposedly Gambit had betrayed the X-Men. Now that story has long since been defunct in Marvel, but at the time this story was written, it was true. That version of Gambit had created something called the Momentary Princess. The Momentary Princess was basically an artifact that contained all knowledge of the future and basically all past events. So that individual who holds the Momentary Princess knows everything that's going to happen in the timeline up until the time in which it was created, right? It doesn't have knowledge of like after it was created. And I want to say it was created in the year like 2084 or something like that. The idea here, and the reason why Gambit had to go back in time in the first place, was basically to appease Kandra, right? Kandra, of course, being an external and basically the one that the tithes are paid to by the Thieves and Assassins Guild. The issue is that the Thieves Guild had failed to attain the Momentary Princess, which is what Kandra wanted. So she withdrew being the benefactor of the guild, which meant they could no longer attain the elixir of life. Immortality was effectively gone, right? That's what you get when you satisfy the tithe when it comes to the Thief and Assassins Guilds. And so with that being the case, Gambit went back in time to basically get the Momentary Princess and give it to Kandra in order to satisfy the debt, to make up for the fact that the guild had failed. A lot of that is basically a side plot. What really matters in 12 and 14 is that this was the story where Gambit crossed paths with Sinister because he effectively needed Sinister's help. And in this story, Gambit had his powers restored. Some of you guys may know about this and some of you guys may not. Gambit, as he currently exists in Marvel Comics, that's not his most powerful form. In fact, there came a point in Gambit's life when he realized he couldn't control his powers that he basically went to Sinister and had a partial lobotomy performed, which removed the full brunt of his abilities but gave him the power to control his abilities. There were two other parts of that story, one of which focused on Courier, which is the way in which they came across Sinister. Courier's kind of cool, right? Jacob is technically his name, but basically when he comes across Sinister, Sinister realizes that Jacob is not actually who he claims to be because Jacob's pretending to be a woman. Sinister basically screws with Jacob's genes and then takes a portion of those genes for himself, and that's how Sinister gains the ability to shapeshift within Marvel Comics. The other part of this was the Black Womb project. Technically, it's not overly important for the character of Gambit, but it does become important for New Sun. The reason being because the Black Womb project was basically a project started by Sinister, to be quite honest, and the idea was to literally pay a woman to continually get herself knocked up. The idea being that he could take those babies, because she was faking miscarriages, he could take those babies and experiment on them in order to understand his own genealogy. The idea survived past Sinister, and it actually became a government project, a government-sanctioned experiment. So it was pretty twisted and pretty sadistic. Another part of issue number 14 and one of the actions of New Sun is he travels and meets with Warren Worthington, Archangel. The two of them strike up a deal in the sense that New Sun is like, I'm going to hire you for a job. And when Archangel asks what it is, the response is, you have to kill Remy LeBeau, right? You have to kill Gambit. And on the surface, the question is, why in the world would Archangel go after a member of the X-Men? That actually gets taken care of later on in the annual. After that, you go into issues 16 and 17. Again, these don't directly deal with New Sun, but they do deal with Gambit's abilities now being restored to their full potential, and Gambit learning how to use them. It also kicks off a storyline called the Assassination Game, which is amazing. It's a really, really cool storyline. One of the things that you discover with Gambit's new abilities is that he's also able to start exercising more control than he had in the past. And one of the things that the new Sun Saga hit on was that Gambit's inability to control his powers when he was younger, given how vastly powerful he was more of a psychological block than anything else. He didn't actually have to have a piece of his brain removed. But the fact is, there comes a point when he shows back up and he encounters Rogue, and he's able to physically kiss her, which kind of blows Rogue away. And one of the things he reveals is that because of the nature of his abilities now and his ability to control those powers, he can actually create a kind of sheen over himself. Now, this is a concept largely borrowed from the Age of Apocalypse. Magneto did that in that storyline, right? He and Rogue produced a child with Magneto being able to literally cover his skin with an incredibly thin membrane. So, condom jokes, go ahead and make them. I know they're coming, but the fact is, right, like, no pun intended, but I know they're going to be there. But that's the thing, right? Like, Gambit is able to do that here. The other thing that's established specifically in issue number 17 is that because of the nature of his powers, Gambit is actually able to charge human tissue, which is something he was not able to do before. It was only ever really inanimate objects, but now being able to touch people, specifically in this instance, Colossus, and charge them with kinetic energy was kind of mind-blowing. It was a huge revelation because now he was a serious and credible threat to anybody that he could come into contact with if he chose to attack them. But where you start to get back into the idea of New Sun kind of brings us back to issue number 16, specifically when Jacob shows back up in the present day and meets with New Sun. Now, one of the side effects of Jacob kind of being screwed with by Sinister is that Jacob couldn't turn back into his male form again, so he was kind of stuck as Jacqueline for a period of time. But there's a discussion that takes place here, and it's pretty significant, that what New Sun says, from the whining tone of your voice, Jacob, at least you're back to normal. And one of the things that Jacob does is refer to New Sun as the mysterious world sculptor. And that's one of the things to be aware of. New Sun was exceedingly enigmatic in this story. No one really knew what his motivation was outside of whatever he told them. And most people were suspicious about him, but at the same time, they wanted to believe him because of the promises that he made. The other part of this discussion is a woman by the name of Fontanelle, and that's really when the discussion gets important. At least I think that's how you pronounce her name. But Fontanelle was basically a dream walker in Marvel. She's able to enter into people's dreams and then interpret them in a variety of different ways. Historically, she had used those as a kind of psychotherapy for people who were struggling with any number of psychological ailments. But in this particular instance, she was hired by New Sun in order to gain as much information as he could possibly get on Gambit. The issue is that she had basically worn out her welcome. And that's what he tells her, right? Like, first of all, Fontanelle, I have never displayed aspirations of a dictatorial nature or monarchist intent. And second of all, your opinion is not required. You have performed your assigned task well, Fontanelle. Through your telepathic dream probes of the people Gambit has known, you have given me valuable information for my plans. Circumstances have dictated that I alter my plans. And that actually is because of Dr. Doom. But he says, if there's one thing I've learned, it is to go with the flow. Your assignment is done, Fontenelle. Your services are no longer required. And then, of course, he turns his attention to Courier, to Jacqueline, right? Asking the question, what about your resolve? Because Courier is exactly what his namesake sounds like, right? Courier just basically goes out and delivers information. In this instance, he was almost kind of like a go-between for New Sun and Gambit, and would oftentimes accompany Gambit on these various missions that Gambit was sent on. But for the actual assassination game itself, as awesome as that storyline is, it actually kicks off when Bullseye goes to attack Gambit. The two of them get into a fight, and it's pretty solid. It's a pretty cool fight. One of the funny things that goes on here, and it's kind of a crazy thing, when Bullseye stabs Gambit in the chest with a dagger, Gambit starts to pull the dagger out, and you don't necessarily know everything that goes on. That actually gets explained at a different point in time, but Gambit is quite literally rewriting reality in this moment. That's the point where his powers have progressed to. And so, of course, Bullseye basically says, like, I know all about you, Gambit. Gene Joke, X-Men Phoebe can charge objects and make them explode. But taking a sigh through the body and surviving, I'm impressed, I will admit. And he says, let's see how you do with a hollow point through the head. And when he goes to pull the trigger, nothing happens. And he's just like, why can't killing any of you yutzes ever be easy? The crazy thing about this is that in the middle of that, he's suddenly met by 3 different versions of Daredevil. They all start attacking him at the same time, and it completely throws him off, right? He has no idea how to process what's going on. And in fact, he even accuses Gambit of this, right? He's like, LeBeau, is this your doing? My brain's all messed up, and I can't think straight, right? His mind's just not functioning the way that it's supposed to. More so than that, whenever he tries to stab one of the Daredevils, the dagger goes right through him. And he's like, how can I fight 3 of you devils, right? Something's not right. I'm sweating a lot. I'm dizzy. Is this worth the $1 million that I signed on for? And then ultimately he bails out, only to find out that the illusion was crafted by members of the Assassin's Guild who themselves have a hit on Gambit. So they're literally trying to call that money in. Now, Gambit ends up bailing out, and he's ultimately rescued by the New Orleans branch of the Thieves Guild. But one of the things that they start to point out here is that Gambit's powers are not working the way that they're supposed to. They're vastly different than they used to be. In fact, one of them says, no disrespect intended, but it's no act of God, right? Remy's mutant powers are saving him. He's literally healing himself. But they say Remy was always good for charging up a card or someone's seat cushion, but this is a bit beyond him. And that's where they kind of recognize that Gambit did something to enhance his powers, but no one outside of him and Sinister really know what it is. Now, of course, as you would expect, Gambit doesn't stay there very long. And in fact, always being on the move and trying to avoid being held down by anybody, he ultimately ends up taking off, only to be met by Bullseye yet again. And that's where the fight picks up. And it gets pretty awesome because at that point, Gambit just asks, like, what's the deal, Bullseye? And literally, Bullseye's just like, standard contract, right? Flat fee payable upon receipt of the corpse. And Gambit's just like, who hired you and why? And Bullseye's just like, do I look like a man who asks questions? Because Bullseye doesn't care, right? You give him some money, you tell him to kill a guy, he's going to kill that guy, right? And that's it. The guy's got no quarrels, got no scruples about killing folks. The dude will kill families if you pay him to. And so Gambit's just like, fine, then we'll do it the hard way. And it's one of these cool moments because you never really see Gambit fight Bullseye all that often. And Gambit is a far more prodigious fighter than people give him credit for. I mean, he's not like a world-class athlete and a world-class fighter. He certainly can't go toe-to-toe with Captain America. We saw Steve Rogers beat the hell out of him during Avengers vs. X-Men. Not to say that Gambit didn't put up a fight, but he still got beat nonetheless. But still, going against someone like Bullseye, who's a prodigious killer and an even better fighter, it's pretty awesome to see. And that's what Bullseye just tells him, right? Like, you're fast, but it's not going to be enough. He says, I kill the way others breathe. So no matter how good you are, I am always better. And he just like kicks him off the building. And then at that point, Fontenelle emerges. Now, one of the things to keep in mind, and one of the things to know about this, is that following Fontenelle being fired by New Sun, her focus shifted away from helping him because she believed in his idea that he was working on something, as mysterious as it was, to save humanity and to save the mutant population, that now her emphasis is focused on figuring out who New Sun is, what he wants, and what he's about. And so that's why whenever Gambit's unconscious, she'll appear to him, right? She would pop up, kind of walking through his dreams, and just kind of be like, we need to figure out what's going on, right? You need to understand what New Sun is about. There's precious little information that I have on him, but one of the things that I've basically figured out is that he is some version of you. I don't know which version of you he is, but he is a version of you, right? Make of that what you will, which ultimately leads us into the annual. And that's when a lot of these little pieces begin to come into play. And it's one of the reasons why I've kind of fast-tracked a lot of what we were talking about so far, because it's so well consolidated here that the conversation basically picks up between Courier and New Sun. And Courier says, Remy survived just like you intended, but to do so, he needed to push his recently restored and artificially increased power levels to a much higher degree, just like you intended. But it got a bit complicated. And that's where New Sun just says, Bullseye nailed him with a blade to the heart. Remy then used his mutant powers to kinetically charge the knife's atomic structure as it slid into him, turning it into the same fission arc that now permeates his internal systems. It was painful to his natural biorhythms, but the blade didn't actually cut anything. Gambit quite literally rewrote the atomic structure of the blade to basically turn it into energy. And that's where Courier says, I was really talking about other things. Other players got involved. A mutant hunter named Executioner and his crony called the Fireballs showed up, and I never contacted them. But that's where New Sun's like, I brought them into the game. Like, I'm the reason that they're here. But that's where Jacob just kind of continues on, right? The assassins we hired, at least the ones that I knew about, Bullseye, Constrictor, Zarin, Batroc the Leaper, Crossbones, they all took their turns on Gambit, and they might have even succeeded since Remy was disoriented and exhausted from having his powers pushed to the limit. If it weren't for the intervention of the Assassins Guild of New Orleans, the natural rivals of Gambit's Thieves Guild, because apparently they had an independent contract on Remy, and then his ex-wife, Belladonna, was leading the charge to fulfill the contract, and so the two guilds worked together to stop the remaining assassins in the field, while Remy and Belladonna were trapped in a collapsed building, which might not have been as rough as it sounds, and in order to free them, Remy pushed his power even further, creating a kinetic fission reaction confined to the debris field on top of them, causing the molecules to collapse within themselves, and the surge to just dissipate. And so Jacob says the whole thing turned into a reconciliation between the guilds who'd been fighting for centuries. So literally, Gambit and Belladonna united the thieves and assassins. And so Courier says at sunrise, our contract expired, the game was done, and they all lived happily ever after. And that's where New Sun says, yet we still had one operative left in the field. And that's where Courier says yes, but he's just there to push Remy even further, right? And New Sun just says, and is he fulfilling those obligations? And that's where Courier says, as we speak, because of course, that person is Warren Worthington. It's Angel, and the fight between himself and Gambit is pretty extensive here, but Gambit doesn't really understand why it's happening, right? Like, why is a former X-Men, a member of the original X-Men, coming after me, right? Is it something that I've done? Is it something that I've said? Is it because of the mutant massacre? Is this guy after me because of that? Like, none of this is really making any sense. Even the people watching the two of them fight are just kind of like, that doesn't make any sense. These guys should not be facing off against one another. And so while Gambit himself is saved by like Nightcrawler and Colossus and basically whisked away, that's when you pick up with Angel meeting with New Sun. And New Sun just says, why did you turn it into a public spectacle, Warren? And Warren just says, it's kind of hard not to be noticed in the middle of Manhattan when you're a guy who flies. And so New Sun just says, like, why do you think I created a hideaway removed from time and space? Why do you think I've been so covert in all of my dealings? I do not want to draw attention to my activities. I brought you into my plan because I needed you, Warren. Complete the assignment as we planned. But here's the kicker about all of this. What you end up discovering, the whole fight between Angel and Gambit was a ruse. None of it was real. The whole idea was to concoct a plan that would allow the X-Men to essentially confront New Sun alongside Gambit so they could defeat him. And they almost do. And for a while, it looks like they do, right? They end up facing off against New Sun, and then New Sun just overpowers everyone. I mean, just absolutely wrecks everybody with the sheer breadth of his strength. Something that we hadn't really seen up until this point, right? Exactly what he's capable of and the full extent of his power. Complete and total control over what's basically all energy around him, to the point that it's borderline matter manipulation. Now, it's not done on some crazy grandiose scale, but this is the first time that Gambit actually learns and sees for himself that New Sun is an alternate version of him. He has heard it in a couple different ways. He's heard it from Angel, he'd heard it from Fontenelle, but seeing it with his own eyes and realizing that it's all true completely throws him off guard. Because at that point, Gambit's whole statement is, I do not want to be like you, right? I don't want to have this crazy level of power. I certainly don't want to change the world or anything like what you're doing, clearly some kind of villainous scheme. And so in the midst of all the chaos, the entirety of the cave just comes crashing down, leaving him for dead, right? Leaving New Sun basically dead. And one of the things that Gambit does is kind of a last little indicator here is he writes on rock, snow, what have you, Chateau New Sun, abandon all hope, ye who enter. Now, of course, no way New Sun goes out like that. Right? This guy who's supposedly super powerful and all that kind of stuff gets killed in a cave-in? Not a chance. He escapes pretty quickly. In fact, his escape happens in issue number 22. It's not a great big huge moment. It's only about a page or so, but that's when you go into issue number 24. And that's the fight between Gambit and New Sun. And what ends up happening is New Sun quite literally grabs Gambit, seemingly out of nowhere, and yanks him through a portal that had been created by a guy named Quiet Bill. Now, Quiet Bill had kind of been not to sound corny, a quiet part of the story. Quiet Bill is a guy that has the ability to look into alternate realities, and New Sun had been using him for that purpose. Now, we'll talk about why that was the case here in a second, but in this place that Gambit doesn't recognize, New Sun just asks, right, confused, don't be Gambit, you are on my world, my Earth, or at least what's left of it. And Gambit gives this kind of monologue, right? He says, New Sun is me, or rather, the Remy LeBeau of an alternate Earth, except he doesn't have my name, my experiences, my accent, or even my buns. Then again, I don't have the same level of control over the mutant biokinetic charging powers that we share. He's far more powerful than me. New Sun came to our Earth after his was Charworld, apparently, and he said he needed my help in saving our planet. That was the initial agreement that was made between Gambit and New Sun when the two of them first encountered each other. I need your help to save the world. If you help me, I will get you back home. And Gambit says it turned out he meant it needed to be saved from me, or him, or maybe both of us, right? What do I know? Seconds ago, I felt a tug as if someone were dragging every cell in my body through a cheese grater. And here I was, and it looks like New Sun found his way back to his world by using my friend Quiet Bill, a mutant who can see through portals to alternate realities. And so that's where all the questions start getting answered. That Gambit recognizes that New Sun hasn't killed him because New Sun wanted Gambit to see this world, to see how New Sun destroyed his own world. And that was one of the questions that Gambit had, right? In fact, he asked that. He's so much more than I am, so much more than I ever wanted to be, which leads me to the question, if he wanted me dead, why didn't he just kill me? Why would he have gone through all of this trouble? And so New Sun responds to Gambit's statement about New Sun wanting Gambit to see how his world died by saying, I did not kill my world intentionally. You of all people, Remy, are acutely aware of the nightmare that we share, the fear of our powers raging out of control, atomizing animal, vegetable, and mineral alike. But while you have woken in a cold sheen of sweat, secure that it was only a nightmare, I lived through mine. And Gambit just says, so your mistake, right, your pain justifies everything you've done to hurt other people. And New Sun just says, if it will prevent the same thing from happening to another world, yes. I regret the pain that this causes Quiet Bill, but without him, getting back to your Earth might take me as long as it did to find it. And so Gambit's just like, okay, so are we going to talk or are we going to fight? And New Sun just tells him, we're going to talk. And New Sun explains his origin, right? He says, I was born in Alpha 1, this world's foremost mutant research and genetic planning facility, a much larger scale and more controlled version of your world's black womb. I never knew my parents. They had been paid for the potential that was inherent in the joining of their genetic material, not for the trouble of raising a child. I was prepared from birth in the use and exploitation of my powers. By the time adolescence came, which triggered my mutant abilities, I was well enough versed in their use that I incinerated Alpha 1 and left to find my way in the world. I wandered a few years learning how to adjust to the complex morality of human civilization. For a time, I joined Professor X and the X-Men, but after killing this world's version of Phoenix, I was no longer welcome among them, and so I wandered more, sometimes as an ally of the superhumans, sometimes as a foe, but always uncomfortable with my role in life, until I was about 18 and met a man named Jean-Luc Lebeau. On your world, he's your adoptive father. On mine, he was a friend and a mentor. He showed me the prophecies of his ancient guilds, how the man born with red eyes would guide his people to the resurrection of the old kingdom and heaven on earth. And that's where Gambit kind of looks around and is like, this don't look a whole lot like heaven on earth, right? I assume the whole project failed. And that's where New Sun says, no, it actually succeeded. And that's the saddest part of it all, because it worked exactly the way the prophecies said it would. That according to the text, my presence unified the guilds of the world, and I was prepared to serve as the host for the re-emergence of the king. The old kingdom was called a heaven on earth, a shining beacon predating Atlantis and Lemuria, lost to the ages, but whose return would enable mankind to join hand in hand, black and white, Jew and Muslim, human and mutant, towards the shining light of the sun. Little did we think to take the prophecies literally, but when the energies of the long-dead king were channeled into me, it was the beginning of the end. My biokinetic powers, in conjunction with the mystical energies, the essence, I imagine, of the old kingdom, created an uncontrollable cascade of energy, a domino effect, toppling from one atom to the other, one molecule after another. The very fabric of the reality that we call Earth caught fire that day, and it consumed the entire planet in a matter of hours. Everyone, everything, dead. A quick death, I always rationalize, though how can someone quantify the depths of unimaginable and unbearable pain? The only one spared the Holocaust was the person responsible for it. And so he says, ravaged by grief and guilt, I tried to undo what I had done, to remake time and control the flow of kinetic energy from the standpoint of time instead of space. What I believed to be the ultimate expression of my and our abilities. One that you touched, if but for a brief instant, in 1891 when Mr. Sinister surgically restored the biological contents of your secret vial back into your brainstem, reconnecting the original nodes in your cerebrum that you had asked removed, so as to spare yourself from the potential of everything that I have endured in reality. You became an expression of the kinetic flow of the universe, of which time is but one facet. And so New Sun says, I failed in my attempt, the scope being too large for my desire, but in my panicked actions, I served to breach the spiral, the space between multiverses, and upon seeing an infinitude of possible Earths that could potentially fall as mine had, I decided to go on a walkabout. I saw many worlds, many Gambits, some Remy LeBeaus, eventually arriving on a world in the death throes of an age of apocalypse. I watched the valiant sacrifice those people made to spare a universe, and I rode the omniversal waves to the M-Cron crystal's explosion to land on yet one more world. Your Earth, Remy, once scarred by much superhuman activity, but as yet spared the same tragic mistake I had made. And so he says, arriving on your Earth, I decided my mission would be to save every Earth I could from my doppelgangers, or as in the case of your world, save Earth from you. You already know that my original plans to prepare a counter-Earth as a haven for your world's population were scuttled when Dr. Doom transported an entire planet in opposite orbit to Earth, which actually happened during the Heroes Reborn storyline, because this comic takes place in like 1999 and 2000. And so Gambit asked the question, right? Like, you figure that if you couldn't save everybody on Earth from me, you'd save me from everybody on Earth. First by getting me to understand how to use my powers, and now by what? Like stranding me here? And the response of New Sun? No, actually, by killing you here, and just immediately fires on Gambit. And what follows is basically an Omega level mutant fight, because Gambit is learning how to use his new powers as he's using them. Because he says, I'm sizzling here, but not from me. I lock on to my own molecular structure and shut down the charge. It hurts in a way that I cannot describe. I lock on to his flow of energy, and I feel his surge through the biokinetic field, and I let that wave rush right back at him. Gambit literally fires New Sun's attack back at him by manipulating New Sun's own power. And he says, this is not a fist fight, a barroom brawl, or kung fu action, the stuff that I can usually handle. This is a mutant sorcerer versus a mutant party magician. And that's where New Sun is like, that hurts, right? That's crazy. Like, you shouldn't be able to do that. And that's where Gambit says, and then just like that, it clicks. Something I've been afraid of and been avoiding ever since I was a kid. My own powers getting turned on like a light switch in my head. A kinetic wash burns the gravity around me. I float. I burn. I let loose with all my pain, my fear, and my anger, and I let it all out on New Sun. He goes from what's left of New York to what's left of Iraq in seconds. And New Sun's flabbergasted, right? He was just like, you should not be able to do that. And Gambit just says, I feel invisible hands grab hold of every cell in my body and yank. And I guess it's hard to hear my scream with all the noise and explosions. A joust it is then. We hit a mile above the planet. Reality around us splits in half. And when we land, we end up where it all began, literally, the resurrection site of the Old Kingdom, somewhere in southeast Turkey. It looks like New Sun and Jean-Luc had to dig at least 100 feet into a mountain just to uncover this site. And that's where New Sun, in this fight, where Gambit is actually controlling New Sun's own powers, right? New Sun just says, you knew, right? You always knew. And that's why you went to Sinister when you were younger and asked him to lobotomize you, to take away so much of your power. And you knew that you had no choice in the past when asking him to put it back. You knew how powerful you would be, but it will not be enough. And he says, I've trained in the full use of my powers since I was 12 years old. You cannot be as powerful as me. And that's when Gambit realizes he only has one ace up his sleeve. And he says, what you don't seem to understand is that I don't want to be. And so quite literally, he takes all the power that he has within himself and channels it directly into New Sun. So much power that New Sun cannot control it and cannot contain it. And he says that, right? I cannot contain this much power. And Gambit just says, I know. And so in the midst of all this chaos and all this pandemonium, the statue comes crashing down and impales New Sun on the spot and kills him. And so Gambit says, prophecy fulfilled, sort of. Remy LeBeau skewered on the spike of the king. All that energy inside of New Sun, raging out of control, and then a pin gets poked into the balloon, and it just pops. Quite literally, he explodes with energy. He just explodes, right? That's all it took a spear puncturing him, and he pops like a balloon. And so following that, Gambit's basically yanked back into the present day, right? Into the main Marvel universe, right? From New Sun's reality. New Sun's entire universe, right? His world and everything just basically disintegrates, and that's essentially the end of him. So with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this to an end. Kind of a chunky video here, but I figured we've never covered the New Sun Saga. So yeah, this run of Gambit's about 24, 25 issues long. So try to condense them down as much as I could. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. This is the New Sun Saga. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it. If you did, drop a like. Make sure you guys hit the subscribe button. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.